First of all, what we're talking about today are FDIs. Well, let's not lose the broader pictures. Europe is still the first area in the world in terms of attracting inwards FDI. And that's a very good thing. And of course, the last thing we want to do is to discourage people from investing in Europe. Yes, you said that, Anthony, it's true. A safer system comes at a cost. It's both a cost and an opportunity. And you have to balance, I believe, the cost of not having a safe system. We have some recent experiences about that. It costs a lot in terms of net financial cost, but also growth, versus the cost of the regulation. So there is a cost to the regulation, but there is, of course, a cost as well of having no regulation or bad regulation. The 80%, I would say, of the regulation we have put forward over the last 3 years, which you referred to as a tsunami, yes, that's a lot. I would acknowledge that. There are virtually two reasons to this. Well, the first reason is that we had more than 20 years to catch up in terms of deregulating or non-regulation of some sectors, with accumulation of risks in these sectors. And secondly, this is because Europe committed to the G20 agenda, and 80% of what we've been doing was simply and merely implementing the G20 agenda, which arguably all of our G20 partners have done or should have done. Now, among these many partners, there is one that is more important than others, of course, and this is the United States of America. And the reason for that is that over 70% of international trade in financial services is done between Europe and the US. So we have paid specific attention to ensure the highest degree possible of regulatory convergence with the US. As Peter just said, nonetheless, we have different histories, different legal systems, different constitutional obligations, and therefore our laws are not the same. Plus, we made basically a different choice from the outset. The US chose to first draw the big picture, that's the Dodd-Frank, and then try to fill in, sometimes with difficulties, and they're still busy doing that. And our approach was, instead of drawing the picture of a wall and then trying to put bricks in place, was simply to go brick by brick and try to build the wall. So maybe what we lost in sort of broad overview, we gained, I think, if we look backwards now, in speed, because I think we're slightly ahead of our American friends in terms of having completed the work. So, but still it comes at a cost. So let me address your different set of questions. Because, of course, the issue cannot be summarized only to international convergence. These regulations have a cost. Basel III has a cost. MiFID will have a cost. All these regulations have a cost. You mentioned as well Solvency II. Solvency II is a bit of an exceptional case because Solvency II is not G20. Solvency II is an idiosyncrasy of the European Union, so we are the only ones having this. It's of course a bit difficult to request equivalence under these conditions and force our trading partners to adopt the same rules as ours. But for all of these rules, what we are doing now is being engaged to a calibration exercise in order to try to reconcile to the best possible way safety, resilience, and growth. Of course, if you remember when we adopted CRD4, which is the implementation in European law of the Basel III agreements, I remember the commissioner was very heavily criticized because we refused to carve in stone the liquidity ratios. And the reason why we refused to carve in stone the liquidity ratios is that because we believed that the way they had been initially calibrated by the Basel Committee in 2010 was ill-advised at all. And actually, in many discussions we had with our friends at SEC in the US, we saw that our opinion converged on this one. But even more in the case of the European Union, because we are heavily dependent for the financing of our economy on banks, a lot more than the US. And the continent is even more than the UK. So for us to kill the transformation function of banks was probably the last thing we needed, because we would have organized a very nice credit crunch. Well, this credit crunch happened to a certain extent, but it would certainly have been a lot worse. Simply remember that the impact of the liquidity rules, as initially calibrated in Basel, was at least 2 times more powerful than the impact of the capital rules. So piling up the two together, we thought would have been a bad idea, with a bad calibration in particular, and especially as these liquidity rules were not, and still are not, in force. I note, incidentally, that the Basel Committee, in the meantime, reviewed the issue and came to a sounder calibration. We believe there are still some progress to be done to arrive to the calibration we would wish. The same is true for Solvency II. Solvency II initially was requested by the insurance sector in Europe. They were the ones that were bringing the project. Of course, they soon realized that what seemed to be a very good idea in normal times, in crisis time, could be something more difficult to implement and be detrimental to long-term investment. And this is why for a year now with the European Parliament, we're trying to find a sound calibration that ensures both resilience of our insurance system and the ability preserved for this insurance system to finance long-term the economy. It's a very difficult exercise, because the last thing we need in present times is probably a solvency crisis in the insurance system. So we need to do everything to prevent that. On the other hand, insurers are one of the biggest institutional long-term investors, and we have to preserve this function. So calibration is crucial, and we're doing it text by text in a very cautious way. There are a number of other regulations, you mentioned some of them, the net result of which is to withdraw liquidity from the system. That is absolutely clear. You mentioned, for example, short selling. You could have mentioned as well MiFID. In a way, you didn't have 10 years ago any algorithm playing on the market for high-frequency trading, and still liquidity was ensured in the market. So the issue is not so much liquidity as such. The issue is that the financial system is a bit like a junkie. If you have not this type of liquidity, which is pretty artificial, you can live quite well. But of course, the problem is to withdraw it. And then when you withdraw it, you should ensure a number of mechanisms to do it relatively cautiously and step by step. Because if the junkie doesn't go with heroin all of a sudden, then probably you will have problems.